I'm Dinda Elliott. I'm the executive director of the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. The big story coming out of China in the past couple of years, of course, has been the slowing economy. Official statistics state that China's GDP is something like 5%, but most independent economists say the number is significantly lower than that. One thing that's clear, the decades of double-digit growth are over. Our speaker today believes that the reason for China's economic challenges are systemic, not cyclical. Chenggang Xu is the author of a new book, which is coming out in June, called Institutional Genes: Origins of China's Institutions and Totalitarianism. And it's already, even before publication, attracted lots of attention among Chinese intellectuals. Dr. Xu's research focuses on political economics, institutional economics, law and economics, development economics, you can see a theme here, transition economics, and the Chinese political economy. Dr. Xu is a senior research scholar at the Stanford Center on China's Economy and Institutions, and a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He's also a visiting professor at the Department of Finance at Imperial College London. He has previously taught at the University of Hong Kong, at Tsinghua University, at Seoul National University, and at the London School of Economics. He was the president of the Asian Law and Economics Association, and importantly for us, Dr. Xu received his PhD in economics from Harvard University in 1991. So welcome back, Dr. Xu. We're equally delighted to welcome Professor Meg Rithmire as our discussant today. Meg Rithmire is the James E. Robison Professor in the Business, Government, and International Economy Unit at Harvard Business School. Professor Rithmire's primary expertise is in the comparative political economy of development with a focus on China and Asia. Her first book, Land Bargains and Chinese Capitalism, examines the role of land politics, urban governments, and local property rights, regimes in the Chinese economic reforms. Her second book, Precarious Ties, Business and the State in Authoritarian Asia, examines state-business relations in Malaysia, Suharto's Indonesia, and the People's Republic of China. So she and Dr. Xu will have lots of interesting things to talk about after his talk. Professor Rithmire also holds a PhD in government from Harvard University. So thank you both so much for joining us. Over to you, Dr. Xu.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me to have a chance to share my views with you about the Chinese institution. In today's talk, I'm going to narrow down a bit since it's mainly about my book, but today's talk is going to narrow down. And I understand that I will not be able to finish my talk, so let me just highlight the major points that I'm going to talk about today. So these are the major key points for today's talk. The first key point is that China's fast growth is over and the deep troubles are coming. And not only on the surface, the growth is over, and debt issues, so on and so forth. But actually, here I'm arguing that today's China shares many similarities to those which we observed in former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe in the 1980s. So I'm going to discuss that in my talk. And here, institution is the key behind these, when I say similarities, so behind the similarities. The second point, since here I'm arguing that institution is the key, so what is the institution? So the second major point is that the institution is, according to what the Chinese Communist Party claims, that the party controls everything. So that's the institution. So when the party controls everything, so what is this institution? That is a totalitarianism, just a definition. So this is claimed by the Communist Party, but also this is recorded as a definition in political science. And this totalitarian institution actually is not originated from the Chinese itself. So it's transplanted from Soviet Union. And I'm going to explain a little bit about this. And the third point is about understanding how the Chinese institutions are emerged and evolved. And from there, we will have a better understanding about the perspectives of the future of the Chinese institutions. And as an observation, we can see that totalitarianism in China is more persistent than that in Russia, although the first totalitarian institution emerged from Russia. So then here we want to understand the reason why. And then the fourth major point is about a totalitarianism with Chinese characteristics, which I call that as regionally administered totalitarianism. That is in comparison with the so-called classic totalitarianism, which is the Soviet type of institution. And understanding this totalitarianism with Chinese characteristics is essential for our understanding of the Chinese successful economic reform. So why at the early stage of the reform succeeded, and then why the Chinese Communist Party reversed the whole thing. So all of this can be explained by this particular type of a totalitarian regime. And then the last point I like to discuss is that the motivation for the Communist Party to launch economic reform is for preserving the party rule. For the same reason, preserving the party rule is the highest priority for the Chinese Communist Party. And that is the reason why the whole thing is reversed. So that's why we see the problem today. And because of this reversal, the private sector declined and the growth declined. So then we have all the troubles. And that is finally why the Chinese is sharing the trajectories of the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe in the 1980s. And since I believe I don't have the time, so I'm not going to show statistics in this talk, but I do have statistics after the talk. So these are already in the final part of the slides, but I'm not going to talk about it. So I'm preparing those for questions. So if there are questions about statistics, I will show that at that point. So let's start from the fundamental institutions of the People's Republic of China. I call that as a regionally administered totalitarianism, which is, first of all, is a totalitarian regime, means that the party controls everything. But in addition to that, there is a Chinese characteristics, which is about administration. So administratively and also economically, the regional party-state authorities played dominant roles. So these are essential. So that is China. So that differentiates China from Soviet Union, although in both cases, the party controls everything. And so then what is a totalitarianism? So here I'm applying the definition given by Friedrich and Brzezinski, 1956, again, from Harvard University. So here, the key is the party controls everything. So in their book, they talked about the 6 aspects. So in that era, 6 aspects means everything. But today, we should add one more thing, which is data. So the party controls all the data. So we just add one more thing. But here, I have to also emphasize another important point, which is not clearly discussed in their book, which is about the nature of the party. In addition to controlling everything, the nature of the party is not, by definition, a political party. A political party, according to Max Weber, is going to be voluntary. So joining and quitting, that's voluntary. But the Communist Party, a totalitarian party, is not voluntary. Moreover, a political party means political competition, but a totalitarian party would not allow for competition. So the party is above everything. The party controls all the organizations, but not within organizations. According to Max Weber, a political party is within organizations. But here, a totalitarian party is different. And then here, I also like to emphasize that this totalitarian system is not originated from China, since China, by tradition, there was no party. So the party, particularly a totalitarian party, was a creation of Russian. It's a creation of Lenin. So it's emerged from Soviet Union. So it was foreign. But then the question is why the Chinese eventually embraced this system, and why this system found a root in China, and now is much more persistent in China than in Russia. So then we have to address this issue in this book. So in the book, I talked about the origins of totalitarianism in terms of ideology and also in terms of institution, and also how that emerged from Russia and then Soviet Union, and how that transformed to China. So then how the Chinese institution emerged and evolved over a long history, long imperial history. And then based on that, I explain contemporary Chinese economy and the political systems, and also the reforms and the troubles today. So this is a map covering most of the chapters in the book, particularly the chapters about China. So here the Chinese, when we talk about the Chinese institutions, talk about the traditional institutions, that is the Chinese Empire. And that lasted for more than 2,000 years. So here in the book, I discussed how the institutional genes of the Chinese imperial system have been emerged and evolved over the more than 200 years. So that's native Chinese institutional genes. But then around the turns of the 19th and the 20th centuries, there were two exogenous shocks. The first exogenous shock was from the West, particularly from the Great Britain and Japan. So these were the constitutionalism, if not democracy. So the Chinese intellectuals, first they believed the constitutionalism, and there were two constitutional reforms in the Chinese Empire, and both of the reforms failed, and then there was a Republican revolution of trying to establish constitutional rule. But all of those failed, and then here we have another exogenous shock, which is the totalitarian institutions from Soviet Union. So in 1920, the Comintern, as a missionary agency of Soviet Union, of the Soviet Communist Party, came to China. And then they established a branch of the Comintern. That branch has a name called Chinese Communist Party, so which is a Russian agency. But here, really the key point is that that developed very, very quickly. So we talked about constitutional reforms, Republican revolution. These lasted for decades and all failed. But here, when the communists came, within 10 years, they established the first government, which is called the Chinese Soviet Republic in 1931, in Ruijin as the capital. So the PRC is just an extension of this the Chinese Soviet Republic, right? So here, really, the point is how comes the communist regime could be established in China so rapidly. And then here, by 1949, the Chinese communists took over the whole mainland China through civil war. And then by 1957, they have established a classic type of totalitarian regime in China completely. So at that time, the Chinese system is pretty much the same as the Soviet Union. The only difference is that they speak Chinese, not Russian. And also, they were much more backward, poorer than Russia. That's the difference. However, the Chinese communists did not just go along this route. So by starting from 1958, there was a great leap forward. And then in 1966, there was the Cultural Revolution. These are the two major waves changing the Chinese institution from the classic totalitarianism into regionally administered totalitarianism. There is a huge literature about the Great Leap Forward and about the Cultural Revolution, but here my emphasis is about the change of the institutions through these two waves of campaigns. So here the key of this regionally administered totalitarianism is that the administration powers, administration capacities, and also resources were largely delegated to the localities. But that actually serves for the purpose of further controlling the ideology and further controlling the personnel and the strategic issues of the totalitarian regime. So that actually is the key for our understanding of the Chinese economic reform, or called post-Mao reform. So the post-Mao reform, here we have to emphasize the purpose of that reform. So the purpose of the reform is to save the Chinese Communist Party after the Cultural Revolution. And in 1979, before any reform has been launched officially, Deng Xiaoping made a public announcement, which is the so-called 4 cardinal principles, 4项基本原则. And these 4 cardinal principles are the party's control, the proletariat dictatorship, the ideology of Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought, and socialism. So these are the 4 cardinal principles, or put in another way, these are the 4 red lines that the reform would not touch upon. And indeed, he actually implemented all of this in the whole 1980s, including the 1989 massacres in Tiananmen Square. But then, here, the reform really started in the 80s and the 90s, and here a key element of the reform is the growth of the private sector, the emergence and the growth of the private sector. That turns out is critically depends on this particular type of institution called regionally decentralized authoritarianism, because these were the local authorities' initiatives. And there was no central party's command or instruction allowing for private firms. So these were the local initiatives in the regional competition. So I'm going to, I hope I will have time to elaborate that point. But then the fast growth of the private sector was associated with a fast growth of civil society, NGOs, so on and so forth, and also sort of semi-independent mass media. These were regarded as threats to the communist rule. So be afraid of so-called peaceful evolution. Peaceful evolution means the party's rule would be eroded gradually. So fearing this peaceful evolution, there was a wholesale restoration back to totalitarianism since 2013. So up to now, we see this restoration of the old type of institution. So here is a brief illustration of the institutional genes of the Bolshevik Party. So here I decompose the basic institutional elements into three parts. The central part is the Tsarist imperial institution, which is essentially how the Bolshevik is going to rule the nation. The way of ruling the nation, a very large part of those actually were inherited from the Tsarist imperial institution. And then on the lower, this part is another important institutional genes of the Communist Party, which is the Russian orthodoxy. The way the totalitarian party doing the propaganda, the way the totalitarian party penetrates the society, controls the society, lots of those were inherited from the orthodoxy, including the Orthodox Church, and also the way the orthodoxy, how they do propaganda, including the personality cult, how to do that. And then another critically important part is how the party is organized. So the way the party is organized is pretty much based upon the existing secretive political institutions in Russia. These institutions also call themselves as terrorist organizations. That's their own label. And that's the way the Leninist party, the principles being laid down by Lenin. So how the Leninist party is going to organize is based upon this kind of existing institutional genes. And the reason here in the book, I argue, the reason this kind of thing would find strong reactions and being received by the Chinese very quickly is because the Chinese, among the three institutional genes, Chinese shared two. So the first one the Chinese shared is the imperial institution. The Chinese imperial institution has a much longer history than the Russians and much more sophisticated, and they know much better than the Russians about how to control the empire, the top-down control, and through a sophisticated bureaucracy. Moreover, the Chinese share this part, the secretive political institutions. So in Chinese tradition, these are called 黑社会 or the secretive society. But the only thing missing in China is this part. But this part actually was supplemented by the Comintern. So the Comintern, as a missionary agency of the Soviet Communist Party, actually played that role. And so that's the very quick summary of my explanations why this totalitarian system found roots in China very quickly. And here, this is a very brief illustration about institutional genes of today's Chinese regime. So in the center is the party-state bureaucracy, which controls the whole society. And, but that alone will not sustain. So on the lower left block here, that's the party-state control over land and the financial resources. Here, literally, all the land is state-owned, and nearly all the banks are state-owned. So that is the economic foundation and also a sort of a legal foundation in terms of property rights. And then the other part is the lower right corner. That is on the personnel matters, the key personnel matters and ideology. All of these are controlled top-down by the central authorities of the communist regime. So this is the illustration of the institutional genes of contemporary China. And then this is the history. So here we can see the similarities. And that is my way of explaining why the totalitarian regime in China finds its roots so quickly and so deeply. So here in the center, that is the imperial bureaucracy. And in Chinese literature, it's called the Junxian system. Junxian means province and counties. Means this is differentiate that from feudal system. So these all the local heads are appointed bureaucrats. But that again here, a bureaucracy alone will not sustain. So then here on the lower left, that's the imperial land system in the sense that all the land, all the ultimate control rights are in the hands of the imperial court. So these are that actually cut off the root of the landed nobilities. So in the long history, China did not have landed nobility, and the institutional root is that. And then these alone would not sustain stably either. So that is why up to Tang Dynasty, there were many challenges, internal challenges, means de facto, there were de facto nobilities emerged to challenge to challenge the emperor. So then here on the lower right, here we the Chinese empire established this imperial exam system. It started from the Sui dynasty, and eventually it became perfect in the Song dynasty. Since Song never ever had de facto nobilities challenging the imperial rule anymore. So that part played an essential role. And so here, the key of talking about this is to compare today with yesterday. So here that's what I called institutional genes. So I'm using the institutional genes as an analytical framework to explain the Chinese institution. And then I already mentioned very quickly that the Chinese communists changed its totalitarian system from classic type into a regionally administered totalitarianism since 1958. And here, the party in that institution, the central authority of the party state is going to maintain and enhance its control over politics, over ideology, over personnel matters, and all the strategic issues. But at the same time, the administrative and economic tactical tasks are delegated to the local authorities, local, or more general, you may call that as subnational authorities. And the different levels of subnational authorities become self-contained in administrative functions. And that actually, since I started to do this kind of research in the early 1990s, and at that time, one of my former classmates at Harvard, Abhijit Banerjee, nowadays at MIT, he raised the question. So the question is this. It's a very interesting question. The question is that if these different ways of organizing the institution played such important roles to differentiate Chinese reform from those in Soviet Union, and then why cannot Soviet Union just imitate the Chinese? So that was the question. And that actually has been one of the motivations for me to look that at a deeper level. So at a deeper level, indeed, changing the institution, changing the way how the institution is going to be organized, turns out is not arbitrary. That's why here I'm developing this concept of institutional genes, because you meet resistance everywhere. So when you try to change, you meet resistance, just like today's United States. So when the president is trying to change everything, and then he's meeting resistances everywhere, for better or for worse. So the same is true. And then if we look at China, this is today's governance structure. It's a very rough illustration. The key point is that on the left side, these are the functions. So in terms of functions, nowadays we are talking about 100 ministries. And then on the right side, that's the territorial control. The territorial control is going to be divided into several levels. So we have a provincial level, city level, and county level. And the key point is that at each county, suppose we have 100 ministries at the central level, then for each county, they are going to have a corresponding 100 offices to the 100 ministries. And the head of these functions is going to be the party secretary of the county. So this is today's arrangement. Where that comes from? Turns out, if we look at the Chinese empire, starting from the Qin dynasty and then codified in the Sui dynasty, and particularly if we look at the Ming and the Qing dynasty, we find the same pattern, the same way of governing the empire. So here, at the central level, starting from the Sui dynasty, there were 6 ministries, and at each county level, you have 6 offices. And the head of these offices would be the head of the county instead of the ministries. So supposedly a minister came down to do the inspection and found something wrong in the function which he is responsible for, and then he would not talk about the office. Instead, he is going to talk about the head of the county. And the same is true in today's arrangement. So if a minister came down to a county, found something wrong, he would talk to the party secretary of the county. He would not intervene directly to the office at the county level. So that actually is terribly important for our understanding about the operation of the Chinese empire and also today's Chinese political economy. Of course, there is a major difference. The major difference is that in the Chinese empire, here there was no party. There was no party means that the imperial court would not be able to penetrate down to everywhere in society. So below the county level, you have the gentries, and you have the family system controlling the grassroots. But under the communist rule, all of these were gone. So the party penetrates in the rural side, penetrates to each village. So every village has a party branch, and in the city, it penetrates to the neighborhood committee. So every neighborhood committee is controlled by a party committee. So that makes the major difference. How much time do I have? 10 minutes, right. Okay, so then here, a key point is about how this right, the regionally administered totalitarian regime plays the role in the post-Mao reform. So here, really the key is this kind of arrangement facilitates the regional competition. So for any communist regime to launch a reform, there has been a major obstacle. The major obstacle is how incentives are going to be provided to the party-state bureaucracy, because reform is going to very often is going to be in conflict with the existing party state bureaucrats' incentives. So how to provide incentive to motivate them to take initiatives in the reform. And in Soviet and Central Eastern European communist regimes, there was no way to do that. So they have to issue decrees, issue commands, asking them to do something, but they had resistance everywhere. So there was no way to push forward. But in China, they mainly relied on regional competition, and the competition is targeting growth rate. So it's a yardstick competition in the sense that if a county grows faster than the peers, then the head of the party secretary of the county would get much better chances to get a promotion. So turns out this is a very powerful incentive. And under this kind of strong incentives, some counties start to play tricks. So although legally private firm was not allowed to be established, however, because of this motivation to grow faster, in some regions, particularly in Wenzhou has more than 6 million population, particularly in that area where they didn't have much state sector, but they had this entrepreneurial tradition in that area. So they protected the private firms, pretending that these are collectively owned. So then there was a very fast growth of these, in fact, private, nominally collective firms. And then the neighboring prefectures imitated them because they found they were in disadvantages. When they grow fast, they were in disadvantages. So then this whole thing spread out. So first from Zhejiang, and then spread out to many other places. So this turns out is so important. So, the same story goes also to the globalization, including these special economic zones, things like that. So that turns out saved the communists. So in 1992, Deng Xiaoping had a conclusion. Since the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, so by that time, all the former Soviet Union and Central Eastern European communist regimes collapsed. And the Chinese communists found threatening. And Deng Xiaoping concluded at that time that the reason they failed is because their economic reform failed. So Deng Xiaoping believed that as long as the Chinese economic reform succeed, then the party rule will be saved. And it turns out, indeed, because of this regional competition facilitated by this red institution, saved the Chinese communist rule. So associated with the fast growth of the private sector, temporarily, the Chinese institution unintentionally shifted from totalitarian to authoritarian, means the control was loosened to some degree. So then there was a booming of the civil society and limited pluralism, things like that. However, the goal of the communist reform is for sustaining the Communist Party's power. It's the same as the Soviet communists. So then they have always faced this fundamental dilemma. So on the one hand, retaining power is the most important. On the other hand, saving the economy is necessary for retaining power. So, but saving the economy, turns out private sector is the key. But once you have private sector, then you have civil society. And that is going to erode the power of the communists. Moreover, the communists also believes that the state sector is the foundation for the communist rule. They have been talking about this explicitly year by year, so all the time. So they worried about the further expanding of the private sector. So then here, the bottom line is that the party must maintain that it controls everything. So then here we have this the reversal starting from 2013. So the last page. So now let me just give a very brief summary of this talk. So the first is that the Chinese totalitarian institution was transplanted from the Soviet Union. And even today, is still there. So not only the party controls everything, actually, there is a complete state ownership of the land, and a nearly complete state ownership of the banking, and the complete state ownership of all the commanding heights sectors. Through these channels, it guarantees that the party controls everything. And second is that the Chinese Communist Party's reform in terms of their objective is never been changed. It's the same as those of the Soviet Union and the Central Eastern European communists, which is holding the power, holding the power of the communists. And that is more important than the economy. The economy is very important for surviving, but holding power is the goal, is the objective. And so that is the reason why they resist the privatization. And here I also have to have a caveat. When I talked about China's private sector, and sometimes I use the term privatization for making the presentation clear, but if we are using the Chinese language, privatization is a taboo, even today. So never ever been changed. And there is no Chinese language about the private sector. They don't use the term private. So they use the other terms because private is going to be in contradiction to their ideology. And so here I would argue that the regional administered totalitarian regime facilitated this kind of institution, facilitated regional competition, and that actually lead to unintentional large-scale privatization and globalization. So that pushed economic growth and saved the communist rule. However, the Communist Party, their fear of a peaceful evolution means changing gradually into capitalism and party losing the power. So then they decided to crack down the private firms, crack down, purge entrepreneurs, and the private sector shrink and the state sector enlarge. And consequently, we observe the reduce of the globalization level and the private investment drop, and the state sector investment goes up, shoot up, and associated with the enlarging of the state sector, the soft budget constraint issue becomes much more severe. So consequently, not only there is a slowdown of the growth, but the debt level shoot up. So actually, China is experiencing a controlled financial crisis currently. So then China's trajectory is somewhat similar to that of former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe in the 1980s. So then people would want to see what is the perspectives, what is the future of China. So because here, when we talk about the 1980s, Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, then 10 years later, they all collapsed. So would China collapse? So here, my answer is that the collapse of Soviet Union and Central Eastern European communist regimes is not only because of the economic troubles. There are other things. So here, when we compare in other aspects, we find that the institutional genes in China in many other aspects are very different from those in Soviet Union or Russia or Central Eastern Europe. The examples would include the influence of the European Enlightenments in history, and also the tradition of a civil society in the past, so on and so forth. Okay, I should stop here.
Please sit.
Okay.
So thank you. It's a pleasure to be able to learn from Xu Chenggang, as I have been for many years. And I should say, because I'm hosting Professor Christine Wong tomorrow, you know, Christine and I were at a conference in Singapore where we were competing to see who could be the most pessimistic, actually, about China. But actually, Professor Xu may be more pessimistic than the two of us actually put together. And so I thought, basically, I'd like to make 3 points, questions, provocations, and have you respond from there. And the first is indeed about that pessimism. And so, I mean, I understand that the dating of reform is from essentially 1977 to 1995, or is it 2012? So 95 rather is the period of decentralized authoritarianism or totalitarianism.
Oh.
Then we go back to authoritarianism, and then 2012 is the end of that experiment, and we see a restoration of what you called totalitarianism. And so, in a sense, the story you're telling, which I think would be consistent with, you know, many people, and I share your pessimism overall about the future of the Chinese economy, but basically that its institutions are going to limit the extent to which market energies or private energies are able to be harnessed for economic development in China, and certainly party control is the preeminent goal. I've basically written the same. But yet, what we see in China, even at the current moment, right, is almost, you know, what I would call, just being very contemporary about it, almost a bimodal economy, or two types of economy. So one, this household, local government debt, deflationary spiral, even fiscal crisis at the central level, unless Christine corrects us tomorrow. And on the other hand, DeepSeek, EVs, right? And all of that may be characterized by, you know, the Chinese term 内转, involution. On the other hand, there's tremendous competitive energies, tremendous levels of innovation. And so I wonder how you see that pessimistic cycle and the optimistic cycle appearing side by side, and how that might play out politically. I have my own views, but I wanted to provoke you there. That's my first point.
Okay. Should I respond now?
I think yeah, sure. Or you want to wait.
Easier.
It's easier. Okay.
Otherwise,
okay.
I forget.
Please.
Yeah. Right. Right. So, if this talk was not today, but just 2 years earlier, then you would not see what you just described. So here, okay, so what happened in this recent 2 years? When we talked about this, the reversal, the peak of the reversal was around 2018, 2019, so, or 2020. So that was the peak. And the peak actually didn't mean to be the peak. The peak was what the Chinese Communist Party intended to do. But then they run into deep troubles. So when they run into deep troubles, they were desperate to find a solution. And one of the solutions, a key idea, was to promote R&D, promote high tech, promote EVs, things like that. Turns out, almost all of these were in private sector. Mm-hmm. That is the reason. So not because they changed their mind to support the private sector. Instead, they were desperate in R&D, and then they found that that's the only option they have. So then they have to do that. But at the same time, we also have to make it clear about how important those sectors are compared with the Chinese economy. Mm-hmm. So in terms of a percentage, those sectors, in terms of percentage, are very small. So there's no impact to the Chinese economy. But those indeed have huge impacts psychologically.
Mm-hmm. I certainly I think the main way in which they have very little impact on the Chinese economy is that it doesn't drive employment for people. The robots make the EVs and the robots make the robots.
Yeah, because they only wanted to have been on the frontier in R&D. And they have a wrong interpretation of a TFP, the total factor productivity. Sure. They thought the TFP is determined solely by technological progress. They didn't understand that the TFP, particularly for China, the major part of the TFP comes from the institution, from the management, not from technology alone, since China is still a developing economy.
I'll tell my MBA students that management matters. My second question or provocation is about ideology, right? So I heard two terms quite a bit, communism or communist, right? And I also heard totalitarianism, but you and I have had a previous exchange about yet another ism, which is actually fascism. So the idea that basically it doesn't matter, and my question is how ideological you think the CCP is at all, right? Because you described a very practical, black cat, white cat. The mouse is a monopoly of the party state's control over the polity and the society. And fundamentally, whatever happens with the economy is in service of that particular goal. And, it's very fashionable to say that Xi Jinping, who you didn't mention, who I'll turn to in a minute, is very ideological. And I wonder if you think that's right, that there's any fundamental belief in communism as an ideology in China, or as if totalitarianism is, fundamentally it's aideological. And fascism, insofar as it's a category beyond just a historical phenomenon, is the idea is it doesn't matter who owns the means of production, it matters who controls who owns the means of production. And so I wonder what you think the ideological content is to China's institutional genes, or if that's a relevant question at all.
Okay, great question. This is always, since there are many confusions. So here, in my book, I emphasize this as a communist totalitarianism instead of communism alone. So a full word should be communist totalitarianism. So what do I mean by this? So here really the key is the totalitarianism. And to understand why the first totalitarianism comes from communism, we have to know where communism comes from. But once you have this, once you already have a totalitarian party, already have a totalitarian regime, then totalitarianism is the key. And everything else is actually for sustaining that. So take Deng Xiaoping's four cardinal principles as a leading example. What is ideology? These four cardinal principles, they are ideology. That is the ideology. So the reason Deng Xiaoping emphasized so much on this is not for the original communist idea. It's for sustaining the party rule. For sustaining the party rule, you have to have a set of beliefs and a set of criteria. So no one is going to challenge this. And for example, when the Chinese communists use the term Marxism, what do they mean? So what is Marxism? Marxism is very complex. What they mean is the proletariat dictatorship. That's it. And indeed, Karl Marx, he himself said in his later years that my greatest contribution to the human being is my invention of proletariat dictatorship. That's it. So you don't need to know the other elements of communism. As long as you believe proletariat dictatorship, that's good enough. So that is ideology. And that ideology itself is just for sustaining the party rule. So that's my response to this question.
It's very helpful. I have a last question, and then we'll open it up to people who are certainly smarter than me, which is about Xi Jinping, whose name you did not mention in the entirety of your talk. I'm sure his name appears in your book, although you'll have to give me an advance copy. So what's very interesting, obviously you date the restoration of regionally administered totalitarianism to 2012, which is no surprise. That's when Xi Jinping became the preeminent leader in China. And the way that you spoke about the CCP over time was as if it's a unified group of leaders and people. And that I wanted to push on just a little bit, right? When we think about the Soviet transplant, of course, what destroyed the Soviet Union, and I'm sure my American patriot colleagues would say it was MTV and McDonald's and Reagan, but right, was basically choices made by Soviet leaders like Gorbachev under financial and fiscal pressure and pressure given imperial overextension, et cetera, to undertake reforms within the party and then within the Soviet Union itself. And so when I spend a lot of time now thinking about the Hu Jintao era and how maybe that was perhaps the anomaly, but is it impossible in your understanding of the CCP, its ideology and its institutional genes, to imagine a party that's once again capable of self-debate and perhaps self-reform under the pressure of external circumstances, which I think many of us think are only likely to grow in China over the next decade or so?
Right. Okay. So in my view, this totalitarian regime itself is a machine. It's a machine in the sense that, of course, the leadership, the personality of the leadership plays roles. However, no matter who is going to be the leader, the machine is the machine. So once the one being put on the leadership role, the machine is going to run. So the reason I'm saying this is actually the so-called machine means the collective incentives of the party state bureaucrats. The collective incentives means that they collectively wanted to make sure that they maintain the power. So whoever being the leader is going to go with that. So if someone deviates from this, this one is going to fail. So that's part of the reason I deliberately not to emphasize on Xi Jinping as a person. So hypothetically, we could think of the time when Xi Jinping gained the power. So there were alternatives. So the potential alternatives would be Bo Xilai or Wang Qishan, but they are all the same. So they have different personalities, and strategically, they may play different. They may play games a little bit different at the margin, but essentially they are all the same. And here, let me highlight another point, which is written at the end of my book, differentiating the Chinese totalitarian regime from that in Soviet Union. So in the Chinese regime, the so-called princelings group has strong power. The reason I mentioned Xi Jinping, Bo Xilai, and Wang Qishan, that's partly that's the reality. Partly they are all in the so-called princeling group. That is critically important because those guys, from their very early time, they have a belief that take for granted they are going to be the masters of the land. They believe this since the Cultural Revolution. But if we look at the Soviet Union, they didn't have this. So after Stalin, all the top Soviet leaders were from blue-collar families. So they were all graduated or cultivated by the so-called youth league system. So when the political scientists in the United States talking about these two factions, the youth league group vis-a-vis the princelings, that is a Chinese phenomenon. This is not a Soviet phenomenon, not in Soviet Union, not in Central Eastern Europe. And when you talked about the changes in Soviet Union, indeed, the part of the reasons why these top Soviet leaders and elites changed their mind. Actually, these changes were not only in Soviet Union. You find these changes in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, in Hungary, in many Central Eastern European nations. And these are related to what kind of family they grew up and what kind of a background they share. But the reason the Chinese has this princelings group so strong, that's related to the institutional genes. So in my book, I elaborate this.
Well, you're giving me an opportunity to say publicly my favorite thing to say, which is that basically everything Xi Jinping has done is the Chongqing model on a national scale. And so people like to draw a contrast between Bo Xilai and Xi Jinping, and I see basically no light. And so it sounds like you agree with me. So with that, thank you for responding to my provocations and also ending on a note that nepotism is bad. I also appreciate that. But we'll now open it up to others of you who have been sitting here graciously and certainly have questions for Xu Chenggang. Okay, so.
Please introduce yourself first.
Hi, thanks for being here, Professor Xu. My name is Daniel Fu. I'm a research associate at the business school across the river. You mentioned earlier that EV, AI, solar panels, these things, they account for a small percentage of Chinese GDP, like maybe 8%. I'm wondering if that number goes up as it is, on trajectory to do, would that cause you to rethink some of what you were hinting at today? And second, just out of curiosity, how do you assess, the relationship between the private sector and Beijing to change in the context of what we're seeing with tariffs and other exogenous shocks? Do you feel like, the relationship with the private sector in China is going to improve, or actually will we see a more hardened state as a result? Thank you.
Sorry, you were talking about the GDP. I didn't hear clearly.
Sorry, you had mentioned earlier that AI, EVs, these things account for maybe a small percentage, like 8% of Chinese GDP. So yeah, I was wondering your thoughts on that, how that would change. Thank you.
Right. Okay. In my talk, I didn't mention what is the most important obstacle for China's growth. That actually is the domestic demand, and the low domestic demand is the result of the low household income compared with GDP, and the low household income is a consequence of the state ownership of land. So here, when we talk about the poor in China, who are the poor? Mainly the peasants. Why the peasants are so poor? Because they don't have land. So they, over the past decades, the land prices appreciated a lot. But these, because of the state ownership, so all the revenues from land would be the revenues of the government. So, so without solving that issue, this is actually a common issue in all communist regimes. So as long as you have state ownership, then you have poor households. So without resolving that issue, there's no hope for China to grow further, no matter what kind of efforts they put in high tech. And so if we focus on high tech alone, then we have to spend a lot more time. So I guess I stop here.
I'm Bill Xiao. I'm a retired professor of economics at Harvard. I have a question. It's more specific. In 2003, Hu Jintao delivered at the 18th plenary said China has to walk with two legs now. Previously, China only focused on economic development, which can be measured by GDP growth. In 2003, Hu Jintao declared China going to walk on two legs. One leg is economic growth, other is social development. That made the Chinese policy much more complicated, because then you have to make trade-off between social development and economic growth. In your regionalism, did China allow the regions to have the flexibility then to say what trade-off they're going to do? How much they're actually going to, for example, take back the private sector? Then they are going to have difficulties then for the social development. Can you explain how does the Communist Party under your institutionalism deal with issues like that?
Right. Yes, indeed, as you said, that at that time they talked about the social issues, but actually those issues have been discussed a lot since the mid-1990s already. More specifically, this social safety net, the social safety net issue. And those were related to the reform programs at that time. So the reform programs would require the large scale of layoffs from the state sector, and Zhu Rongji did it. But at that time, they found the lack of a social safety net became an obstacle for laying off, because laid off workers didn't have a support. So since then, they quite rapidly developed a very primitive social safety net, and around 2003, that, in my view, that is a kind of a continuation in that direction. But that is actually is not going to address the issue of inequality, of enlarging inequality. So if we look at statistics, by 2019 or 2016, I don't remember exactly, according to a nationwide sampling survey, the household survey, it shows that roughly about 540 million population were under the poverty line, defined by $5 per person per day. And among this 540 million, a very large number of them were actually much poorer than this poverty line. So the poverty issue is overwhelming, and so in the past, people thought as long as the economy grow, then perhaps you have a fast growth together associated with inequality. But now, in my view, this inequality itself contributes to the obstacle of the growth, because this is more than just inequality. This is low income. So the overall, the Chinese household income is too low. So that becomes the obstacle, the ultimate obstacle, if we don't care about the politics, only looking at the figures, only looking at the economy. So that itself contributes to the collapse of the growth model.
We could go on for a long time, but we have reached the end of our time here. And so I just want to congratulate Xu Chenggang on the book, and thank you for sharing your findings with us, and certainly a very provocative talk. And thank you very much, and we'll see you all tomorrow for Professor Christine Wang on the Chinese fiscal system, I assume. All right, thank you.